So good afternoon and welcome. I'm Stephanie Traina, and I'm in charge of adult programming and community services at Memorial Hall Library. The library has been partnering with the Addison Gallery for several years to offer in-person talks and tours, and we're very grateful to have Gordon Wilkins joining us today. After the events of this past summer, following the murder of George Floyd, the library began working on a program series focused on racial and social justice. We reached out to the Addison Gallery, and they've offered two talks. Today's talk is led by Associate Curator Gordon Wilkins. There's another talk scheduled for Wednesday, December 9th at 2 p.m., led by Jamie Gibbons, Head of Education, and Tessa Height, Curatorial Fellow, and they'll be focusing on Civil War, painting, and photography. So a couple of Zoom housekeeping issues. Please send any questions you have through the Q&A box, and they'll be answered at the end. I'll be keeping an eye on that. The chat is disabled for the audience, and everyone will stay muted throughout the webinar. Today's program is being recorded and will be available on the library's Vimeo channel and the Addison website and social media pages. So I'll now turn things over to Gordon Wilkins. Thank you for being with us today.
Okay, so thank you very much for a wonderful introduction, and thank you very much to the Memorial Hall Library for facilitating this talk today. And I apologize for the terrible lighting. I had a whole lighting set up in my office, but we're going to get started and carry on. Okay, so here's a beautiful exterior view of the Addison Gallery. I'm hopeful that many of you have visited and that perhaps you visited since we've reopened. We've been open about a month now, and we are open Friday through Sunday for the general public, and you can go online to our website to reserve your free tickets. The show that I'm going to talk about, here's a nice sort of overall view of the exhibition. The show that I'm going to talk about, which is called To Make Visible Art and Activism 1980 to 2000, is on view at the Addison until January 3rd. So if this, which it seems like it will, unfortunately, the second wave keeps hitting us, I would try to get up here to see the show sooner rather than later. I don't know if I would risk waiting until the holidays to see the show. That I can't predict what's going to happen, but I have a sort of a bad feeling about it. So anyway, this show came about in response to a planned installation that was supposed to kind of carry on the theme of another one of my shows that's up right now, which is Currents, Cross Currents, American Art 1850 to 1950. We initially envisioned sort of a continuation of that on the first floor of the Addison, where we would look at sort of everything that happened in American art. Well, I say everything, but a selection of what happened in American art from 1950 to 2000 or thereabouts. And so we got together as a curatorial team and sort of divided it up by decade. And I was given 1980 to 2000. And I sort of did a very broad search of our collections database by decade and went through hundreds and hundreds of works from that fall within those 2 decades. And really came to the conclusion that the strongest theme of these works was this constant or sort of pervasive engagement with social justice issues, with politics, and with activism broadly. And you'll see in the exhibition, many of the objects don't really fit the mold of what we would consider to be protest art. You won't see some of the sort of more iconic examples of 1980s activist art, thinking of a lot of the public interventions against, or public displays against the HIV/AIDS pandemic, for example. But there are a great number of works in our collection that really address the pervasive themes of the 1980s and 90s to around 2000. And they address these themes in ways that are both overt, profoundly overt in some cases, and then also covert. And the show really looks at how both strategies produce effective political or activist art. I would argue that all art is in some way inherently political, but these works sort of transcend that low bar and are quite decidedly political in nature. Although you'll notice some are far more coded or cloaked, sort of in a language, in some cases, of the oppressor, and it's sort of this idea of utilizing or even problematizing the idea that you can sort of undo. Where there's the expression that you use the master's tools to destroy the master's house, but some artists, as we see in this exhibition, really question if the master's tools, and I use that, of course, as a sort of metaphor, if they can even be rehabilitated or utilized to full effect, or to really affect change broadly. So. In the wonderful introduction, there was mention of the murder of George Floyd, and I think it would be pretty fair to assume that this show was a response to that, and to the pervasive unrest and sort of resurgence or reinvigoration of the racial justice movement in America over this past summer. And the show very much is informed by that, but as I mentioned before, was not actually planned in response to, but was planned prior to the events of this summer. Of course, the show has evolved since, and I think it takes on increased sort of an increased sense of urgency. So we start off with this humorous cartoon by William Hamilton, who is in fact an alumnus of Phillips Academy and a very celebrated New Yorker cartoonist who really was known for his trademark were these, you can see in these two women, what they call ski slope noses, these beautifully pointed little noses. And he tied those noses to this WASP elite that he saw developing in the 70s and 80s. And if we think about what happened in the early years of the 1980s, you see this full-throated sort of repudiation of the 1970s, the 60s, but more importantly, the 1970s. And you see this desire amongst people who felt that their society was really being sort of overthrown, or that the very structures that kept primarily white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in power were being threatened by the activist movements of the 70s, by the feminist movement, by the Black Power movement. And there was this reaction against that. And we see that manifesting in the election of Ronald Reagan and his landslide victory in 1980, where you have this silent, quote unquote, silent majority of white, Christian, and increasingly suburbanized Americans reacting to what they perceived as this, the upheaval, the chaos of the 1970s. And they feel alienated by this post-war liberalism and turbulence, and want a return to quote unquote normal American values. And with this act, with this election of Reagan, you really see a dialing back of the advancements that the 70s, that activist groups in the 70s had fought so hard for. And you see this kind of dialing back of LGBTQ rights, of women's rights, and of rights of racial minorities in the United States. And this era, the Reagan Revolution, as it was called, was characterized by conservatism, both politically and socially. You have the rise of the religious right, for example, going hand in hand with this Reagan era. And you have the trickle-down laissez-faire economics dominating that era. And what I find really striking about this period is that it really never ended. Even though we have these 2 decades in focus in this exhibition, I think many of these works speak sort of as pointedly to this 2-decade period of the last century as they do to today. And so these works remain quite relevant. So back to this first image, you have these 2 women, elegantly attired, probably Upper East Side society types. And they are at a restaurant, and the caption is heavens. He's not worrying about his money. He's worrying about money itself. And I think that kind of encapsulates one of the predominant themes of the 1980s, or our popular understanding of the 1980s, and that was this obsession with consumerism and consumption and the accumulation of wealth and capital, which has of course been the case in America from the very beginning, but was really intensifying during the early years of Reagan, and this desire to conspicuously consume, and the alienation that caused amongst those who could not attain the lifestyle that these two women, for example, had attained. And this ran in the New Yorker in 1983. And if you go into the exhibition, this is a small case. You'll notice we have the framed original drawing, and then actually you can see it in context in a page that was removed from the New Yorker, which is kind of an interesting exercise. And I'll get into what else is in this case in a moment, but I'll just briefly note that this case speaks to some of the new technologies that artists were utilizing in order to produce works that could be consumed not just by the rarefied elite or people who would be able to go to museums or galleries, but could be seen on a lamppost somewhere or on a telephone pole, or you could purchase editions for very low sums of money and disseminate your ideas that way. So we have the New Yorker as one way, popular media, but then you also have things like magazines, zines, broadly artists' publications, and even Jenny Holzer with her pencils, stamps, and book plates, which we'll get to in a moment. So speaking of Jenny Holzer, she's one of perhaps the most famous artists to emerge from this very politically charged period. She has been working since the 70s and is known for her career-long investigation of really the limits of language and the power of language and text in society. So she really interrogates the ways that messages are shared and is really engaged with mass media and the sort of endeavor to co-opt mass media in order to sort of break away from propaganda in order to shine these, what she called truisms. So you have things like "men don't protect you anymore," phrases that reappear really continuously and to this day in her work across a variety of media. So she's probably most famous for her benches. She'll do benches carved with these truisms, plaques, metal plaques, billboards. She drove around, well, not personally, but she had a truck drive around Chicago in advance of the election with similar phrases. And actually those trucks have been all around the United States. So she really understands the power of mass media and how an artist can co-opt mass media in order to further their point of view and their art. Her husband, Mike Glier, who is a professor out in Western Mass, created another sort of ephemeral, again, what we see here, these are not meant to be precious objects. They are it's against their nature to be in a museum collection such as ours. They were meant to be used. They were sold as editions for not extraordinarily large sums of money. And they are, in many cases, meant to be used and disseminated, as you can see. These are actually, we don't have great photographs of our own examples, but you can tell these pencils, like ours, have never been sharpened, and people have preserved them. And you can actually still find them on websites, but I can assure you for much more money now than they were back in the 80s. So back to her husband, Mike Glier, he produced this really incredible body of work called White Male Power. And it's a portfolio of lithographs, photo lithographs. So these are mass-produced prints that would have been, I think, this whole selection of prints of 12 prints costs, $3, something like that. He based the images off of popular media. He actually wrote in an email that there's this one great picture here. This is a an Alaska senator. And apparently Mike Glier in an email was telling me that he went to Washington and asked senators to pose for beauty shots. And then he had his own sort of beauty pageant for senators. And this is one of the more attractive, apparently, senators. But you can see his face is almost totally obscured by the Capitol dome. And you see figures that are recognizable. This is David Rockefeller here with Dave scrawled across his forehead. But again, it's not really important to know who inspired which illustration. But again, this is a way to offer political critique of the regime and of white male power in general. And this is something that Glier was aware of and made an important keystone part of his work in the early 80s. And I think today we could, you could produce something called White Male Power with similar illustrations and realize that not much has changed over the past 40 years, for better or for worse. And white males still hold the bulk of power in the United States. And it's easy to sort of, again, view these works as being very much in a silo of a very particular point in time. But they do transcend that time to bring increased relevance even to our our current era, rather. And I think it's interesting to compare this sort of caricature, kind of grotesque style of drawing with this work by Sue Williams, which is a fulcrum that leads us into a section of works in the exhibition that deal with feminism. And this is a work by Sue Williams, who's a feminist artist. And this is an ink on vellum piece that is quite arresting in person. And you see this, again, this sort of demented looking monstrous creature emerging from this female figure's womb. And I think it offers some commentary, perhaps in context, about the assertion of white male privilege over women's bodies and the desire amongst many white men to control the functions of a woman's body. So I think this could be very easily tied, particularly when read in the context of 2000 and the dawn of the Bush era, and persistent fears on the rolling back of abortion access. You could certainly see this work as something that has to do with male dominion over the female form. And it's transitions into a wall that deals fairly explicitly with work by feminist artists who were engaged in work to create equal opportunities for female artists and women in American culture. So this is quite a large piece by Ida Appleberg, who just celebrated her 91st birthday not too long ago. And she is known for these very boldly outlined figurative paintings that are somewhat reminiscent of a comic style. So you see that here and here as well. So again, looking not just at what is represented, but how it's represented. And you can come up with certain formal trends that unite this very disparate body of work across time. So here you have 5 women. They're anonymous. Their backs are turned to the viewer. You can tell that they're wearing high heels and underwear, but nothing else. We don't know what is going on here. Again, images sort of this image fails to provide context, which is very much the point. She described her work as being like a Rorschach test. She said, "It's always your story. It's never my story. It's never someone else's story. You come with the content in your own head and do a Rorschach kind of association. So whatever it is that you're looking at is a do-it-yourself projective test. But it is also a chaos of nameless possibilities," which I think is a fantastic way of talking about not just her work, but really a lot of the work that you'll see, which is that it's open to interpretation. The work provokes rather than resolves. It asks questions rather than providing the viewer with tidy answers. And I think this is a very strong example of that. I think you can read this within a feminist lens. You have women who are rendered anonymous and are wearing high heels, things that are typically associated with the act of women dressing for the male gaze or for the perception of women by a perceived male audience, a heterosexual white male audience. So they're lined up sort of like at a beauty pageant on display and ready to be consumed almost by the viewer. But again, that's one way of looking at it. And she very explicitly wants us to think about this work, bringing our own point of view to the table and having this sort of direct engagement. So again, thinking of the death of the author and other kinds of philosophical, critical debates going on, it's not so much the intent of the artist that carries in this work, it's really what you bring to it yourself as the viewer. And continuing this great sort of progression of women standing in these very dramatic compositions, this is a fairly early work by Sally Mann, who is perhaps best known for her series Immediate Family, which was published by Aperture in the early 1990s and caused a great deal of controversy over the ethics of representing her children in various states of undress. And those were debates that were really part of the culture wars of this era, and were really led by the religious right, who objected to her work, claiming it was pornographic. She, before Immediate Family, did a very important body of work called At 12, which was also published by Aperture, and I believe it's going to be republished this year, if it hasn't already. So this is a work from that series. It depicts a girl named Becky, and what she did is her children were quite young at the time, and so she went around, and they weren't old enough to model these. She for this series of photographs, because she traveled around her local area in Virginia and engaged with young girls around the age of 12, girls who were sort of in that interstitial space between girlhood and womanhood, and depicted them in these very psychologically charged works. This is a small picture, but it packs really a punch. You'll notice that the figure is her hands in her pockets, and she's bathed in light and dominates the central axis of the composition. But then you start to really read into this and see far more disturbing elements. You see, for example, this hose, looks like a hose at least, encircling her feet, almost like a trap. You could think of it as a lasso or almost a noose. So she's the object of attention, she's a prey object. You see these two male figures on either side, these young boys, young men, adolescent boys, who are also coming into their sexual maturity and begin to see her not as an equal, but as a sexual object. And she is really caught in their trap, almost like a hare caught in a trap in the middle of the woods. So again, I don't know if Sally would say that she's necessarily a feminist artist, but you could certainly read this as a photograph that has a great deal of social commentary embedded in it, particularly about the roles of women, the sexualization of young women, and the perception of women by heterosexual men, and the sexualization of the female body, and the young female body in this case. So this is sort of an overview of some of the works that we've seen. You see, of course, you can't miss the Ida Appleberg right in the middle. And the Sally Mann is the little photograph to the right. And we're going to next talk about this amazing Scream by Lorna Simpson, who is one of the leading artists of our time. She was born in 1960. She's an African-American artist who works primarily in photography, but works a lot in sort of conceptual. She has a very conceptually grounded practice and works a lot with text and image, and the interrelation between text and image. And we've talked a little bit about anonymity. In this work, on its surface, you could see it as kind of two things at once, which is part of this tension that she's getting at. which you see here an anonymous woman. She does not have a head, which is inherently problematic. She's dressed in a very standard kind of dress that is quite unremarkable, with no really distinguishing characteristics. And if you look at the images, which are almost life-size, this is quite a large piece. You look at the images, her body is fractured. She's quite literally decapitated. And you are consuming this image in a way, and it makes you aware of how you view bodies, and particularly as a Black female body, how the Black female body is consumed by the eyes of the viewer, and coming from a white male perspective, which is the kind of the assumed audience traditionally for works of art, which is, again, flawed. You can think about this in one way as a further sort of victimization of the female Black body, thinking about Black women as the sort of the other of the other. There are quotes to that effect that are quite interesting, and thinking about women, Black women being among the being the most marginalized group perhaps in America, and she's very keenly aware of that assumption. So she takes that assumption and then she turns it on her head by including the text at the bottom, where the red text, which is meant, or we assume is the voice of this anonymous woman, where it states she was no more exotic than the sparse room she posed in. So you have this interesting synthesis of text and image, and playing very, very strongly with gender roles, where she is anonymous, but she does have agency. She has agency, but she is anonymous. And she's assuming power, but does she really have power in this image? So it's a very, very complicated work. And Lorna Simpson wrote about her work and said, "I would hate to think that my work is perceived as a portrayal of victimization. It is not enough for me to relate an experience through the work only to have a viewer say, 'Oh, that's too bad,' and walk away from it. I want to relate the dynamics of a situation, both how that situation occurs and how it affects people's lives. In another sense, the work is not answer-oriented. It is intentionally open-ended. There is not a resolution that just solves everything." So we aren't really, at the end of the day, we're not really meant to resolve the meaning of this work. And the assumption that there is one singular meaning for any work of art should always be looked at very suspiciously. What we'll pick up in other works is this interesting preoccupation amongst artists of the 80s and 90s with language, and language and imagery and the limits of both. And there's a great Audre Lorde quote where and this is what I was kind of struggling to allude to earlier, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I think revolutionary groups have, and groups fighting for social justice causes, have often tried, like Jenny Holzer did, to appropriate the language, the messaging of the dominant social structure in order to subvert it, to appropriate it, to change it, and to reshape it. And I think that Lorna Simpson is questioning if that's even possible. Do the master's tools, for example, language in this case, does this language, which is shaped by years and years and years and years of white male dominance, is it so broken that it can't even be fixed? And I think that's something that we're reckoning with today. On a broader, and that's quite broad. So in more sort of concrete ways with systems of, for example, policing in America, can you undo the policing in its current form in America using the tools of policing? That's a question that is very much unresolved. And this work, in a similar way, functions like that kind of logic, inviting us to maybe think of ways that fall outside of what we are familiar with, and to realize that what we are familiar with is not natural. It's very much something that's been constructed over time and by specific people. And that's something also very important to remember. So this prior work, and again, I love this juxtaposition, the two women with their arms akimbo. It's really spectacular. Not to pat myself on the back, but it's pretty spectacular in person. With the Sally Mann, also, it's pretty good. This work, again, is a beautiful portrait. This is a work by Dawood Bay, who has a very important retrospective up right now at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta that will travel soon to the Whitney, and has been an artist in residence here at the Addison many times, and has really credited the Addison with many important breakthroughs in his career. So we have a very strong relationship with Dawood. And this is from a body of street portraiture. He is really a portrait artist at his core, and creates these beautifully psychologically incisive portraits. You might see this and think, why is this political? I think that the very fact that this artist, Dawood Bay in this case, has chosen to represent a woman of color, a Black woman, in a position that, in a pose that speaks to, I would say, some sort of self-assuredness, confidence. She has style. She has, a lot of flair. She's looking at us, the viewer, dead in the eyes. She's really confronting the camera. And it's important to think about this in relation to other depictions of African Americans. I brought up this work by Robert Frank, who was very much an artist who had maybe not explicit political goals, but really documented throughout his series, The Americans. The full 83 picture series is currently on view at the Addison. We're one of 4 museums in the world to own the complete set, just to plug for other shows. He went around the country in the 50s and really documented racial segregation and inequality in America. But again, he was a white male artist. And this particular photograph, San Francisco, and the late, great Maurice Berger wrote a really fantastic essay about this in the New York Times. And you think about the kind of violence of the photographic encounter in this particular image on the left-hand side. The man in the photograph, we don't know their relationship, assuming that they're a couple. It's a man and a woman, and they've been startled. They're sitting, minding their own business in a park in San Francisco, and this strange white male photographer takes their picture without asking permission beforehand to take their image. And the photographic encounter is always one, or is almost always one, of unequal power dynamics. And that's, of course, I'm kind of parroting Susan Sontag, well, Stephen Sondheim and Susan Sontag got mixed up in my brain today. So where you would think about the photographic encounter as being one that is inherently unequal, and that's very much the case in the Robert Frank image. These people who are of a different race living in an extraordinarily racially segregated, even if not explicitly so in San Francisco, but very much racially segregated world of the 1950s in America, being really deprived of any right to control how they're presented to the world. Whereas with Dawood Bay, he himself being a Black man, is able to engage on a very different level with his subjects, and he sees it more as a dialogue between the photographer and the subject, and less of this kind of hierarchical power dynamic of the camera kind of stealing the likeness of the figure. So again, by the very fact that he, first of all, chose a Black woman to represent, Black women historically have been marginalized in American art and photography. So to focus on a Black woman as the subject of this kind of monumental, heroic portrait is in and of itself quite political, I would argue. So here we see the full expanse of the middle wall, and you can see the screen that we talked about in Dawood Bay's portrait here. We have 2 other, I won't go into them, but really beautiful, sensitive portraits of young Black men by Black artists, male artists, next to the Dawood Bay portrait. But we're now going to focus on the central image, which you can't miss, and that is Kerry James Marshall's Souvenir II from 1997, which is one of the really undeniable masterworks of the Addison Gallery of American Art's collection. So this is a very complicated image, and I think we could do an entire hour on this one painting, which really I would make a special trip just to see it. I suggest you come up to see it because, as you know, we don't have, or you may or may not know, we don't have permanently installed galleries. So you don't know the next time you'll be able to see this in person. And it is monumental and extraordinarily powerful. And there's this amazing visual effect of the glitter on the unstretched canvas and the collage elements. It's really, again, spectacular. But here you see what Kerry James Marshall describes as a very typical bourgeois, sort of middle class, I would say solidly middle class, Black Chicago home in the 1960s. You see the Black homemaker, the woman kind of surveying us, looking at her domain. She has a great deal of pride, and you can see the pride that is embodied in the way that this room is kept up. There are fresh flowers. It's very, very clean. You would almost imagine there being a plastic covering on the sofa. It's just meticulous. Everything is in its place. This is the residence of very proud people. You see dead center, this banner, and you see the Holy Trinity of the Civil Rights Movement. And this is a type of image that would have been displayed quite prominently in the homes of Black Americans in the 60s and 70s. And Kerry James Marshall has memories of going into, this is actually based on a family member's home, so going into family members' homes and seeing the sort of civil rights trifecta in these homes. And so what does it mean to have photographic images of these three men in your homes is something interesting. So you have JFK, MLK in the center, and RFK. So you have two white men and Martin Luther King in the center, and it says in memory of. And then also you have these photographs. So it's this interesting mix. It's this really interesting negotiation between the painted image and the silkscreen photographic image. So you have, even around the banner, you have these figures that are sort of haunting the banner. This one is covering it up with its wings, and they're winged figures. So Kerry James Marshall is very knowledgeable about the history of art, and particularly European painting and religious paintings in general. So this is sort of like an Annunciation scene, or sort of a Christian scene, where you have kind of the angels chorus kind of in this cloud above this scene. And these are people that are recognizable. And he includes them because they're people that aren't held to this, or don't have the same kind of level of fame or sort of iconic status as the three men in the banner dead center. There are people like Medgar Evers, the NAACP field representative who was killed in Mississippi. You have the four girls up here who were murdered in the Birmingham church bombing. You have the three civil rights workers who were killed in Mississippi. You have Malcolm X. You have Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, two members of the Black Panthers who were killed by the Chicago Police Department. You have Viola Liuzzo, who is a white Michigan housewife who was murdered by the Klan on a highway when she was driving civil rights workers home from a rally. And then you also have this young man here, Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was shot and killed while trying to protect his mother from being beaten by the police during a march in Alabama. And some of these figures, like Malcolm X, are household names, but others are not. And Kerry James Marshall is really interrogating why it is that we remember RFK, JFK, and MLK, but not Viola Liuzzo in the same breath. They are all martyrs to this common civil rights cause. So it's really illustrating that memory is a construct. There's nothing natural about the way that in which we consume information and construct memory, that it's very much controlled. I would also argue with the trifecta in the middle that there's a selective memory or selective remembrance around these three figures. I would say particularly around Martin Luther King, whose more radical teachings have been sanitized, I think, very much in order to assuage the anxieties of white people who want to see MLK as this peaceful to a fault figure. And what that does is it obscures reality. And these figures, these angel figures, exist as these kind of ghost-like images. They're not fully realized figures. They live in this kind of liminal space because they don't fit in necessarily to this very clear-cut, clean narrative that we've constructed, that these three men were responsible for the civil rights movement, which is, of course, false. And these three men, of course, all have sanitized reputations in their own right. So it's a very complicated work, but really speaking to the act of remembering and how memory is very political. Who we remember and who we forget are very carefully made decisions. Maybe we aren't aware of it, but the people who are producing our history books, who are in charge politically, shape our understanding of events and shape the future generations' understanding of events. This is a wonderful diptych by another Phillips Academy alumna, Wendy Ewald, who graduated from Abbott Academy. She's worked on collaborative photographic projects with children for decades now. And there's a great documentary on PBS that just came out about her work in Appalachia in the 70s. This is a series, this image, Antonio Gunter, is a work from a series called Black Self, White Self that Wendy Ewald worked on when she was in Durham, North Carolina. She worked in the school system there, and she worked with children who were entering a school system that had recently undergone a great deal of desegregation, and this was in the 1990s. So we like to think of desegregation as something of the past, but again, this is less than 30 years ago. And she worked with Black students and white students as well to really interrogate their conceptions of race. So you have this young boy in both images, Antonio Gunter, who was the collaborator in this work. You have his Black self represented, and then you have his white self represented. And so the portrait was taken, and then he annotated the image, and then that was reproduced, and that's what you see here. So here, as his Black self, he wants to be a doctor, he doesn't wear glasses, he's wearing a "Don't Bother Me" shirt, he's very comfortable, he's looking right at the camera. And then as his white self, you can even see the script, his handwriting becomes less confident. It becomes more narrow and less sure of itself. He says he doesn't know where he is. He found the jacket. He stinks. He's homeless. He has dirty pants and tore up shoes. He needs his fingernails cut. He lives in an alley. And that's him as a white person. And I think this is such a complicated work because it subverts the white sort of dominance of American culture, thinking that there's this kind of aspiration, that aspirational whiteness is something that's felt by non-white groups. But this young boy is articulating that he feels comfortable as himself, as a Black person. And as a white person, he sees all of these sort of negative characteristics and really damaging themes. So again, really subverting, I think, a white conception of race in a very powerful way in this work. So we've traveled along the wall. We're now going to stop at one final work on this wall, and this is Glen Logan's untitled speech, Hands, from 2000. And this is a very powerful work to see in person. It's very hard to photograph, as you might imagine. It has this kind of monochromatic Black color, but it's so textural. It's just like this kind of terrain of accumulated coal dust. So he uses coal dust very, very powerfully, and it's layered over a silk-screened image of the Million Man March from 1995. And there also is text that's spelled out somewhat legibly around the top, and you can sort of make out the forms of letters. And these are excerpted from Reverend Louis Farrakhan, the leader of the Nation of Islam's speech at the Million Man March. But again, this work very much deals with the limitations of language, and that we can't rely on language or image alone or really together to convey the reality of an experience. So he's very clearly obscuring this image and obscuring the text. And it's frustrating because you want to be able to see both. You feel entitled to know what was being said and to see the image, but he is really keeping you away from that particular reality by obscuring the text, making it illegible and making making the text illegible and the image unviewable. And he's really questioning the effectiveness of words and images to convey truth, and which, of course, thinking of this sort of assault on the truth that we've lived in for the past several years, feels like a lifetime, but for quite some time. I think this work is extraordinarily powerful, because that we can't trust really what we see and what we read as gospel truth, and realizing that the truth is there is really no singular truth, and that sounds like Trump, but there is a singular truth, but it's not necessarily easily conveyed, or you have to be skeptical of your sources, I guess, is really what is the important message here, and not to assume that you'll be able to get the information just by passively looking, that you really have to dig deep and work at it. So this next wall is a wall that deals with some of the most, I would say, explicitly activist or political works in the show. And this is a wall of work produced primarily by queer male artists, many of whom were HIV positive or had AIDS or died of AIDS, HIV/AIDS related illnesses, and were utilizing their platform as artists to raise awareness and attention to the pandemic of HIV/AIDS and the inaction on the part of the governments of Ronald Reagan and George Bush to sufficiently address the AIDS crisis. You'll see that it's installed in this kind of gallery salon style hang, because there was just really too much amazing work to show, and also to give a sense of just how rich the visual culture, the material that's been left behind is from this era. And it's work that is, I think, still shocking to some. It still really has the power to shock, which I think speaks to its ability to transcend time and to hold up after, in some cases, 3 decades or more. So here you see a grouping of photographs. Starting on the far left, we have an image of Taboo, the famous Boston era drag queen and artist, getting ready for a performance taken by Nan Goldin, who was part of the so-called Boston School of Photographers, who worked in the city in the 80s and documented what was then a very vibrant queer underground scene. She and her comrade friend Mark Morrisroe, who's represented by 2 works, the self-portrait at the top register, and then also this diptych. And this diptych depicts it's a chest X-ray. He worked as an escort. He was born to a mother who had issues with substance abuse and had to live on the streets essentially as a teenager, and was shot by a John at one point in time, and lived with the bullet in his chest. And these are people who were who existed really completely at the margins. Nan Goldin had the ability as a white woman. She herself is queer, but she could sort of go between different worlds and exist in quote unquote polite society in ways that Mark Morrisroe couldn't, or these 2 boys, both by Larry Clark, depictions of young hustlers working Times Square before Giuliani turned it into Disneyland, New York. But for better or for worse, I think for better, getting rid of teenage prostitution, but other reasons why it's not so great. Here you have two young men who are memorialized in photographs. And again, the very fact that a subject is chosen can be in and of itself a political act and an activist act. So he's really bringing attention to the lives, the very difficult lives of these two young men who are making a living on the street in 1980s New York. So you have these images that are sort of provocative or confrontational, perhaps even today. And then you have works that have been totally normalized, but were extraordinarily radical in their time. This is a piece, the caption is incorrect. This is a work by Sage Sawyer from a series that she worked on in the 80s. And she photographed gay couples in their homes in very, what we would consider to be ordinary circumstances. And I think at a time in the 80s where there was very little, if not zero, representation of LGBT figures in media, I think it wasn't really until the 1990s with Real World and later Will and Grace, again, for better or for worse, that you see sort of popular representations of queer men in media. So the very fact that Sage Sawyer was photographing these men in their homes was really a radical act, and went a long way to normalize gay relationships. And this is an style of argumentation that has been deployed to fight for equal marriage, for example, that the sort of notion that gays are just like straight people. And that's a point of view or a way of approaching this issue that has certainly fallen out of favor, but was an effective tool at its time, particularly with people who had very little familiarity with gay life, gay people, or culture, up until the past few decades, really. It's we live in a post-RuPaul Drag Race, post-Will and Grace world, but it's gay representation, queer representation is still fairly new. I read somewhere that the very first movie or a TV movie to depict a gay relationship was a film with Martin Sheen and Hal Holbrook, where I guess Martin Sheen has an affair with Hal Holbrook back in the 70s. Doesn't sound very great. Could be interesting, but that was only the 70s. And that was really the only example of really popular representation up until the 80s and 90s. That's an aside that probably means very little to most people. But anyway, here we have the centerpiece of this wall, which is Hunter Reynolds' Gloves Required for All Patient Contact from 2011. And if you're holding me to the time period that I conveyed initially, that we were going to focus on 20 years, you got me. This is 2011. The reason that it fits into the show is that all of this material that you see was gathered really at the height of the AIDS pandemic in the late 80s and early 90s. And this was assembled by an artist named Hunter Reynolds, who has been living with HIV/AIDS for decades now, and it's controlled through medication. And he has produced a really important body of work as one of the most notable survivors of HIV/AIDS. Many, if not most, of his contemporaries, people like David Wojnarowicz and Peter Hujar and Felix Gonzalez Torres, perished in the 1990s of AIDS-related causes. He has survived, and he has really created work as a way to stake a claim to his survival, to demonstrate that he is still here and that he remembers. These are all newspaper clippings, photographs of newspaper clippings that he's assembled, and he has this vast archive of newspaper clippings related to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and he then collages them and then includes works drawn from his own personal archive. This is a photograph of himself here, also of friends, of other press images. So there's this very interesting layering, even though it's flat, because it's photograph. He photographs the collage. Also with, you see this big splotch of blood here, almost in the center. So a very, very aggressive, charged work. And there's a very interesting quote from him that says, "My body has been literally a battlefield in a war that I have been fighting in order to stay alive. Every project and every exhibition, every performance has been created as an act of defiance in the face of AIDS." So this is really an act of defiance and an act of publicly demonstrating one's survival over time. And then eagle-eyed viewers might notice in the upper right corner, and this was kind of a big shock to us when we were installing the piece, that Tony Fauci, who has become kind of a Christ-like figure among many people nowadays for his work during this COVID-19 pandemic, he was not always a revered, celebrated figure. And this reminds us all, I think, of several things. That is, of the sort of vicissitudes of time and memory, of how people's reputations and perceptions are quite malleable. But then also just kind of a shocking reminder that the same people who were in charge of the HIV/AIDS fight are still around and are now working on COVID-19. Fauci was really vilified for many years by HIV/AIDS activists for what they perceived to be sort of a lack of engagement with the gay community. They accused him of sort of being asleep on the job. But then in the 90s, he made a very concerted effort to connect to HIV AIDS patients into the larger gay community, and has actually been really recast as a hero in the entire era. And really is one of the few people who cared, to put it bluntly. This final grouping of works on the right-hand side, you'll see a mixture of popular media going back to the works by Jenny Holzer, this sort of being able to co-opt the forms of popular media in order to convey complicated and pointed political messaging. We have a bus advertisement at the top. You'll see a photograph of George H.W. Bush. And the quote states, "Like many of us, Barbara and I have had friends who have died of AIDS. Once disease strikes, we don't blame those who are suffering. We try to love them and care for them and comfort them. We don't fire them, we don't evict them, and don't cancel their insurance." And this was a project of Real Artways that was sponsored. Group Material was a famous collective of artists fighting against HIV/AIDS. And I think you can read this in very different ways. I think if you don't know the history, you could see this as a celebration of George H.W. Bush and showing that he was compassionate and cared about victims of HIV/AIDS. I think reading it in context in 1991 when it was produced, it was very much pointing at his hypocrisy in dealing with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, speaking out of both sides of his mouth. Both, offering these words of comfort, but then doing very little for people living with the disease. And then the final image on this wall is very powerful work by David Wojnarowicz, who died in 1992, and this of HIV/AIDS related causes, and this was done in 1990. And it's called Untitled Face in Dirt, and it's one of his more famous images. He is known for his photographs, his paintings, his writings. He was truly an extraordinarily varied talent, and one whose voice is kind of inextricably linked to this time period. And there's a really interesting quote that he gave after he was diagnosed. So this, I believe that the chronology was that this photograph was taken before his diagnosis. He was diagnosed and died. He was diagnosed with HIV/AIDS and died in a very short period of time. But he had seen all of his friends really die of HIV/AIDS by the time that this photograph was taken. And you could read this as he's either kind of a triumphant image where he's pulling himself out from underneath the rubble. But I think more likely, and considering the fact that we do know how this photograph was constructed, where he was buried underneath this dirt, that it's him being crushed by an American society that cared very little for him, for gay people, for those with HIV/AIDS. And it's this act of being kind of consumed by, chewed up and spit out by America. And he has this quote where he says, "My rage is really about the fact that when I was told I'd contracted the virus, it didn't take me long to realize that I'd contracted a diseased society as well," which is extraordinarily powerful. And to think of society itself as the virus is something, again, a kind of a rhetorical device that we see coming up in our current pandemic. He very recently, within the past 10 years, was the subject of great controversy. Again, the culture wars have never really ended. They've just been dormant for a while. This photograph from our collection was actually on loan to this exhibition called Hide Seek that was at the National Portrait Gallery, and it was a show of queer portraiture. And there was a video that he produced called Fire in My Belly that in one part shows ants crawling over a crucifix. And that was enough for the Catholic Church and Republican politicians to threaten to cut funding to the Smithsonian. So this was only, I think, 9 years ago or so. So it very much, we are still very much in an era of aversion to queer artworks, to artworks that speak about the truth around HIV/AIDS, and to works that sort of question dominant social structures. And then floating sort of in the middle of the gallery is this really fascinating work by Tony Fair, who is an artist in residence at the Addison back in the 1990s, and is renowned for his very conceptually driven works that are sort of deceptively conceptual. He was kind of known for being a collector of trash, of things that have been discarded by humanity. Here he has white wire hangers, the kind that you would get at a dry cleaner, that he is kind of woven together in a way that kind of represents maybe the double helix of DNA, some sort of strand, this really dynamic kind of spiraling column. And it hangs just above the surface of the floor. And he talks about his attraction to simple objects. He also worked a lot with things like water bottles filled with colored liquids. We have a great painting in our collection by him that was just foil peanut bags from an airplane that he pasted. That's actually very visually compelling. You wouldn't necessarily expect it to be, but very strong. And he talks about these ordinary objects, and he said, when you strip things bare, you allow them to take on the possibility for broader meaning than if you explain them. Reduction opens the work up. And I think that's really interesting. We've talked so much about language so far and the limitations of language. And here we have something, a very powerful statement that's conveyed without the kind of crutch of words. You see these figures, these hangers that are sort of, I think you could read them as the sort of vestiges of life that no longer is there. Tony Fair himself was a gay man who lived with HIV for many years, and again saw his generation decimated by the virus. So I think that these wire coat hangers that are very thin and flimsy sort of evoke the absent human body. They really speak to what isn't there more than what is there, much in the same way that his contemporary Felix Gonzalez Torres, with his pieces of his assemblage works with candies that have been weighed to, for example, the weight of his dying lover, that you're meant to take from the gallery as to evoke this sort of wasting away of his body. You can see kind of a similar conceptual thread in this work, where you're meant to really project the loss onto this piece and to think about really who is no longer here, and that's an entire generation, really, of gay artists and thinkers and activists. So a very haunting, powerful work. The final wall, and I know I'm over time, but I give myself a little bit of time because of the technical difficulties. The final wall in the gallery is a little odd. You can see we have Tammy Faye and Jim Baker on the far left, but it's a wall that deals with mass incarceration and the development of kind of the enrichment of the American prison system during the Reagan years. And again, another side effect of the Reagan era, which I perhaps would argue has never ended. We're still living really with the legacy of this time period, and not to, because I don't want to get comments, solely blame Reagan. That's not the point of this show, I assure you, but it is a historical fact, and it's a fact that is explored through works. And the artists in this gallery, they were all firsthand witnesses to this era, and were very much influenced by the political realities of their time. So here you have works engaging with prison, with the themes of crime and punishment. Here we have, when I knew that we had an image of Tammy Faye Baker, I just had to include it. We know Tammy Faye and Jim Baker. I think it depends on your generation. I know Tammy Faye from The Surreal Life on VH1. So from her second act, when she was Tammy Faye Messner. Some may know her more from the saga of PTL and Jessica Hahn, the scandal that Jim Baker was caught up in. They were a beloved televangelist duo. Tammy Faye was the heart and soul really behind the operation. Jim Baker was an extraordinarily ambitious and still is. You can still buy buckets of Bibles if you go on his website. He's really into doomsday kind of stuff now. It wasn't quite as much apocalyptic material back at their height in the 80s, 70s and 80s. They started off with a puppet show and then developed into this huge empire with water park and residential complexes. That was essentially a giant scam. And he was discovered to have paid hush money to Jessica Hahn, a church secretary, after she accused him of rape. And Tammy Faye divorced Jim. She became Tammy Faye Messner and became this kind of unlikely gay icon. To think of a woman who was an evangelical Christian, not necessarily the most traditionally the most gay friendly group, but who was able to have this second act as a gay icon before she passed away in 2007. But I think this really illustrates, especially with the addition of again, language, false prophet, playing really with the idea of the biblical prophet, and then also with prophet as in capital, where it's very much an indictment of the religious right, that they're spouting, that they're doing God's work on earth, but really they're using that as a shield to accumulate really unspeakable wealth. In the case of Tammy Faye and Jim Baker, there was even, when they got divorced and their assets were split, it was revealed that they had, a heated outdoor doghouse and all of these, and so many fur coats. So again, the hypocrisy of this kind of doctrine of prosperity, of this kind of gospel of prosperity that you still see in contemporary evangelical Christianity today. So very much exploring in this work by Robbie Connell, who's made thousands of these really amazing politically charged posters that are still quite widely available today. So looking at the hypocrisy of the religious right during this time period. And then the final work that I'll talk about is the most abstract in the show, perhaps. And that's Peter Halley's Prison with Conduit from 1981. Peter Halley is a graduate of Phillips Academy. And I think context is very important. I think this particular painting could be shown in lots of different contexts. It could be viewed as purely formal, but if you look at it in 1981 and thinking about the sort of emergence of this era of mass incarceration in the United States. So just a statistic that I found, that in 1980, when Reagan entered office, there were 330,000 incarcerated people in the United States. And when he left office 8 years later, that number had nearly doubled to 630,000. And that was a level of incarceration that that then and today disproportionately impacts Black and Brown people in America. And today we have 2.3 million people living in jails and prisons across America. And this is not an unfamiliar statistic, but the United States incarcerates more people per capita than any other nation in the world, which is quite sobering to think about, to say the least. But this work, I think, perhaps without, it's maybe the most covert in terms of its political messaging, but just to think about the structure of prisons and the power of the prison as an aesthetic symbol, as an aesthetic device, is quite strong to think about. Thinking about this work in relationship to these larger themes of the kind of pathologizing of criminality, of blaming Black and Brown communities for drug epidemics, and for the disproportionate incarceration of Black and Brown bodies in the United States. So a work that is very abstract, but I think forces us to think about, when placed in context, a much more abstract group of ideas that are very much tied to the reality of the 1980s, and unfortunately the reality of our current era. And so I'll end there. Thank you so much. I don't know how many people hung in there after all of my technical difficulties, and I do again apologize for those. And I know that perhaps we'll have time for questions if anyone has them. And I will, let's see, I'll stop sharing, and I don't know if there are any questions.
Okay. So Gordon, someone asked, thank you very much, very interesting. So is there a catalog for this show?
No, I wish we could do a catalog for everything, but we were talking before this started about how frequently we rotate our galleries here at the Addison. And that is, I think, really one of my favorite parts about working here, is that we have the ability to refresh our gallery so often, but that also doesn't give us much time to do catalogs for permanent collection displays. So there is no catalog, but there's a full virtual tour, which I didn't use, although in past tours I have done, I have used it, because it kind of makes people dizzy, and unless you have a perfect connection, if you're doing a virtual tour, there's often weird lagging and glitches. Anyway, but there are resources available on our website to answer that question. There's a digital preview that my education colleagues put together, the virtual tour. There's also you can see the individual works in the show on our database. So there are ways of accessing the show after it closes on January 3rd.
Very good. And are there works that you would have included in the exhibition but didn't have enough space to include?
Yes, that is kind of the, I would say, one of the great tragedies of my life, is that I overshop. Because I guess I don't have great spatial awareness, although I think it's getting better in terms of how much can fit in a gallery. And I don't know how many objects I had on this checklist, but I do know that we had to cut quite a few. But I think that a lot of what it would have been duplicative rather than additive. So I don't really regret not adding anything, because having extras really forces you to consider what is most important. And I think the works that ended up in the show really speak for themselves and speak together in interesting ways. So that, yes, I drove our prep staff crazy because they matted and framed, I don't even know how many things that I didn't end up putting on the walls. But I think that it helped to sort of crystallize my point of view and thesis. So yes, there's lots that didn't make it, but I don't really regret not having certain things.
Very good. Well, you're getting a lot of compliments on what a wonderful talk.
Oh, and, thank you.
So I sent through the chat just that people should stay tuned because the library will be hosting a number of programs with other libraries. We're working with 7 other libraries in the Merrimack Valley, and mass incarceration is going to be the focus of the programming in the late winter and spring. So more to come on that. Well, thank you so much, Gordon. We really appreciated your time.
And I'm sorry again for the technical difficulties.
No, you really couldn't help it. That's all right.
I couldn't. That's true. I could not help it.
So we did record the event. I'll have the person here at the library who edits things, he can edit out that beginning.
Great.
And we'll make the recording available.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
thanks everyone for joining.
Yes, thank you. Bye now. Bye.